Christmas is approaching, and in much of Christianity, as we talked about before, this time before Christmas, it's called Advent. It's the 4 Sundays before Christmas. And one of the main themes that you might hear during Advent is the idea that Jesus was the Messiah. The idea is that back when Jesus was born, all the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, and Jesus was the fulfillment of that. We often hear Jesus referred to as the promised Messiah. And a lot of Christians have been taught that Jesus was, in fact, the promised Jewish Messiah, but that the Jews just didn't recognize him. And we've heard that so much that Jesus was the Messiah of Judaism that I think we just accept it without thinking about it. So today, that's what I would like for us to think about. Now, actually, the concept of Messiah that Christians today have is very different from the different ones that Jews back during the time of Jesus had. And a lot of times we confuse our concept of Messiah with the Jewish concept of it. And then we make it seem like that the Jewish concept of Messiah was just like the Christian concept, but it's not. So I'd like for us to think about that. Now, to start with, we've talked about in here before how there is no one Christianity. There are many different kinds of Christianities, some of which are very different. There are different versions of Christianity around here represented in the different churches that are extremely different from each other to the point where you'd think it was a completely different religion. And it's the same in Judaism. There is no one Judaism. There are many different versions of Judaism. And that was true even back during the time of Jesus, way back before the time of Jesus. Many different versions of Judaism with many different beliefs. Now, some of those versions of Judaism had some sort of concept of a Messiah, but many didn't. And so back then, during the time of Jesus, many Jews may have been looking for a Messiah to come, but many were not looking for one. And even among the ones who were looking for, there were different beliefs about what that Messiah would be and what he would do. Now, the idea of a Jewish Messiah has its basis in things in the Jewish scriptures, but the idea of a Messiah comes rather late in the Old Testament period. If you remember the history of the Hebrew and then the Jewish people, it goes like this. The Hebrew people left Egypt under Moses. They wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they entered the promised land under Joshua. That took many, many years for them to develop their own society there. They conquered some of the people already living there and they established their own kingdom. And they had some sort of government going on and land that was they had taken from other people and they established a society. And the high point of their society came under King David. But their society was actually short lived. After David died, his son Solomon became king, and things started going downhill during the time of Solomon. And after the death of Solomon, their society split into two parts: Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Now, Israel eventually got taken over by the Assyrians. Judah eventually got taken over by the Babylonians. And then in that area of Judah, after the Babylonians, it was the Persians. Then it was the Greeks, and then it was the Romans. And the Romans were the ones in control during the time of Jesus. So there had never again been a society and a government like existed under David. And among some Jews, the idea developed that that was because they had turned their backs on God and God was punishing them. And then eventually the belief developed that one day God would punish them enough and he would restore them. And then eventually the belief developed that It was not that God would just restore them, that God would put them back greater than they had ever been. And it is from there that the idea of a Messiah came. It was thought that after God had punished them enough, he would make things even better for them than they were under King David. It would actually be an ideal society. And God would bring that about through an ideal king. And under this ideal king, they would be the premier society in the whole world. And they would have peace and prosperity far beyond anything they had ever imagined. And that would continue on and on. This king they were looking for was what some Jews termed the Messiah. And it's important to realize that this Messiah was not seen to be a divine figure, it was a person who would be an ideal political, military, social, and religious leader. Now, the word Messiah literally means the anointed one, and that comes from the practice of how the Jews installed their kings. They would anoint their kings with oil. It was how they installed them into the office, much like our president taking the oath of office. They would anoint their king with oil. And so the term Messiah just refers to anointed one. And in this context, it refers to a king installed into office. Now, in general terms, outside of a meaning related to the Messiah figure, the term anointed just means set aside for a particular purpose. And that is, the person would be set aside to do a certain thing. That's anointing. In the case of the king, the person would be set aside to be the king, and that was symbolized by putting oil on them. So that's the way the concept of Messiah was interpreted in some forms of Judaism. Now, many Jews who expected a Messiah believed he would be a direct descendant of King David. He was expected to be a charismatic leader. He would inspire others to follow him. He was expected to be a great warrior who would lead them in defeating their enemies. He was expected to be a great political leader who would govern well. He was expected to be a great religious leader, a religious leader who would exactly follow Jewish law and lead the rest of the people to exactly follow Jewish law also. Now, all this taken together was supposed to lead to an ideal society, a society with peace and prosperity for Jews. Now, some Jews believed that the government this Messiah would establish would be the center of government for all the world, both for Jews and non Jews alike. Some Jews believed that this Messiah would build a temple in Jerusalem. And some Jews believed there would be several different Messiahs. In one belief, there was the idea that there would be a first Messiah who would be a great military leader, that he would die in battle. And then another Messiah would come along and he would be successful. Some believed in two Messiahs at the same time, one in the religious sphere and one in the political and uh, military sphere. Now, some Jews didn't believe the Messiah would be identified with any one specific person, but that there would be a succession of people who would be what you could call messiahs. And of course, some Jews didn't look for a Messiah figure at all. There were, and are still today, a great many different beliefs in Judaism about a Messiah figure. Now, the point of all this is that there never was one Jewish belief about messiahs. There were always many different beliefs. The reason that's true is that the Old Testament does not outline a clear belief about a Messiah. There are scattered passages here and there that can be interpreted in different ways, depending, I guess, on what you want them to say. And if you interpret those in a certain way, you can sort of get a reference to a Messiah figure. But now other people maintain that those passages don't refer to a Messiah figure, they refer to something else. Now, a lot of times Christians wonder, and I've had people ask me this before, why did the Jews not recognize Jesus since he was their Messiah? Well, that's the assumption there that he actually was their Messiah. But anyway, to answer that question, for one reason, not all Jews were expecting a Messiah. But the most important reason is that among the ones who were, Jesus in no way fits the bill. Now, it's important to realize that most of the various beliefs many Christians have about a Jewish Messiah did not actually come from Judaism. They are beliefs that developed later within certain parts of Christianity, and then they were projected back onto the Judaism of the time of Jesus. Now, Wanda and I do Bible readings aloud every night. We read a chapter or two aloud. I like to recommend reading aloud because it's just different. It just makes you pay more attention, and things are different than if you just read it. Now, we've been doing that for several years. When we first started, we started with the Gospels, and we read all four Gospels several times through. And then we started reading the rest of the New Testament. We read the rest of the book several times through. Then went back to the Gospels, read them several times, and the rest of the New Testament. And this went on for several years. And then Wanda said one day, said, let's read the Old Testament. So we started to do with the Old Testament. And keep in mind that we've been reading the New Testament for years. We started in the Old. Now, the first few chapters of Genesis went by pretty good. Everybody's already familiar with those pretty much anyway. But after we got beyond that and we're in the latter parts of Genesis, then went over to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and all, we were struck by something. Remember, we had been used to reading the New Testament for several years, and when we went to the Old Testament, it was just so different. You see, most people, when they think of the Old Testament, they think of the little passages, little parts, because that's actually all most people read. It's just little parts that are cut out of it. I know a lot of people that have daily Bible readings. They might read an Old Testament reading, a New Testament reading, or maybe reading from the Psalms or something. And they just skip around, reading 4 or 5 verses like that. You just don't get the same effect if you do that. I do not recommend reading the Bible in that piecemeal fashion. You need to read the Bible, not read little piecemeal parts of it. A lot of times we concentrate on the things in the Old Testament, like the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, and stuff like that. But when you do the whole thing, and not just those parts, it's really striking. And one and I talked about how what you get from the Old Testament seems like a completely different religion. Actually, it seems like a different God acting there. It's just so foreign and different compared to the New Testament. Now, I had studied the Bible a lot, but I never really realized that because, you see, the way we did it was we started with the New and we got so used to hearing that. Then we went to the Old and it just struck me. It struck us both how different it was. Now, of course, we're not the first people to ever realize that. We've talked before in here about how ancient Christians recognized that too. And from the historical record, we know there were many big disagreements about what to do with the Old Testament. Frankly, they never really did decide on an overarching view. But here's one thing they did decide on. Some in ancient Christianity felt it was possible to draw a line back from Jesus through the Old Testament figures and Old Testament history and say that the Old Testament represents a flow that leads to Jesus. And some of these Christians went in the Old Testament and they picked out things that, in their opinion, pointed to Jesus. I wanted to give you some of them. Just listen to these. This is from Isaiah 42. Behold, my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed will he not break. A faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law. From Isaiah 11, the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. And from the 5th chapter of Micah, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. From Isaiah 53, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Now, Christians began interpreting those passages as referring to Jesus. They began drawing a line from Old Testament history through to Jesus. Now, of course, those passages have numerous different interpretations within Judaism. Some Jews believe that some of them might refer to a Messiah, but that was not really total agreement among Jews that they all did. Some believe they referred to something else. But Christians began interpreting them as relating to a Messiah, as referring to Jesus, tracing a line through the Old Testament to Jesus. But again, I want to emphasize Jesus does not coincide with any of the various ideas about a Messiah that were or are or ever have been current within Judaism. In Genesis chapter 12, we find what's commonly called God's call to Abraham, and it reads like this. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all the possessions they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your seed I will give this land. Now, some Jews interpret that as being about the Hebrew people leaving Egypt and eventually entering the promised land and establishing a society there, that's what God was promising Abraham. Muslims interpret that as the beginning of Islam. They say that Abraham was the first Muslim, and they look at God's promise to Abraham as being fulfilled in the religion of Islam. And of course, Christianity traditionally interpreted that as a prophecy of the coming of Jesus. Traditionally, they would say that Jesus would come from the line of Abraham. And that's what God was promising Abraham when he said, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, that was the traditional Christian interpretation because of something found in the New Testament in the writings of Paul. It comes from the book of Galatians. And Paul wrote, to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say, and to his seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ. So that was a quote from the Apostle Paul. Paul obviously interpreted God's promise to Abraham as being about Jesus. And that's one of the reasons why the ancient Christians decided to go back into the Old Testament and trace through to get back to the prophecies of Jesus through there. Now, we talked about a little while ago about the term anointed, how it means to set apart, set aside for a certain purpose, something or someone. And we refer to Jesus as Jesus Christ. And Christ is simply the Greek word for anointed. And so to say that Jesus is Christ simply means that Jesus is set aside for a certain purpose. Jesus came here to earth for a certain purpose. A lot of times people think that Christ refers to someone who's crucified, but that's not true. Christ just means someone set aside for a certain purpose. It is the Greek word that means anointed. Another term that's sometimes used for Jesus is the term Son of Man. Actually, Christians don't usually refer to Jesus as Son of Man, but that's what he often referred to himself as. He did that numerous times in the Gospels. No one knows for sure what the term Son of Man means. Jesus did not explain it, he just used it to refer to himself. Different people have different ideas about what it means. They'll tell you, oh, I know what it means. They fool themselves. Nobody knows what it means. Now, there is a passage in the Old Testament book of Daniel that talks about a son of man, and some Christians believe that's what Jesus was referring to, but we don't know. Maybe Jesus was referring back to that, or maybe not. There's no way we can know, and there is no way we can know with any certainty what Jesus meant when he referred to himself as the Son of Man. You know, in the final analysis, what we say about Jesus is a mystery. We don't normally think about mystery in regard to Christianity. You don't hear that a lot. But there are a lot of passages in the New Testament, especially in the writings of Paul, that refer to mystery in connection with Jesus. I just want to give you a smattering of those. From 1 Timothy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh. Now, stop right there. Who was manifested in the flesh? God. Just God. Keep that in mind. God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the nations, believed on in the world, received up in glory. This is a mystery. So the book of Colossians, for I want you to know what a great struggle I have for you and those in Laodicea, and for as many as have not seen my face in the flesh, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, and attaining to all riches of the full assurance of understanding, to the knowledge of the mystery of God. From Ephesians. By revelation, he made known to me the mystery, which in the other ages was not made known to the sons of men. Again from Ephesians. To me, who am less than the least of all the saints, this grace was given that I should preach among the nations the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to make all see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the ages has been hidden in God. From the book of 1 Timothy, holding the mystery of faith with a pure conscience. From First Corinthians, we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom, mystery. That's what he talks about when he talks about Jesus. There are many, many more passages like that. When we talk about Jesus, we have to realize that we are dealing with an unfathomable mystery, a mystery that cannot be put into any little box. We cannot put Jesus into the box labeled Jewish Messiah or anything like that. Jesus doesn't fit into any box. It's a mystery. It's a mystery we can only wonder about. It started with his birth, a silent happening in an obscure, insignificant corner of the world. All the religious people were so sure they knew everything about God, didn't even know it was happening. They were completely unaware of what had happened. Jesus just slipped into the world at night, an event unknown by any but a very few. We've looked at nativity scenes before, and we've seen a lot of the figures. They'd be standing there looking at the baby Jesus. They have an expression of wonder on their face. What's going on here? Nobody knows. Just keep in mind that Jesus is a mystery. It is something that we cannot explain or describe. We don't know. Let it remain a mystery. Let it remain something that we look at with awe and wonder. When we speak of Jesus, we are speaking of a mystery.